thought yesterday was hopefully you didn't feel like it was too much of a whirlwind of information. I like to set up my artists into their historical context, and because I feel that when you're looking at the artwork of somebody, there is so much more to the background of the person to know and understand, to be able to understand how and why and where and what they're painting or creating or whatever it is they are. So that's my sort of reasoning behind all the build-up for everything. And today we're going to look at another exhibition space that also was very significant for Burne-Jones in particular, but again it had very great significance on the art world at the time and the social aspect of the art world and how that affected the artistic output, particularly of Burne-Jones. And we've called it, or it is called, not by me, but it was known as the Palace of Art. I finished with this picture yesterday, which was the sort of shock factor of 1870 when Burne-Jones, refusing to cover up the nudity of the male figure and sort of, as I said, in a petulant way, decided he wouldn't publish again, or wouldn't exhibit again in public. But there was a lot of turmoil, private turmoil, associated with this painting, not just his sort of argument, if you like, with the gallery owners. As I said to you, the artist is Maria. The Phyllis is the face of Maria Zambacco, this beautiful Greek divorcee, very wealthy, very socially capable, who had come into Burne-Jones's life through the medium of his artist model. And I found these beautiful little drawings of her actually working herself as an artist, which she did, and she became eventually quite an accomplished sculptress. But you can sort of imagine in his section of his property that was given over to his studio, he spent many hours, very long, intimate hours with her, painting her. And on the back of this painting, there is an inscription which says, "Tell me what I have done. I have loved unwisely." Because she came into his life not invited, if you like. She just came into his life, and her charisma, her beauty was something that he was not able to deal with. Yes?
Your mic down.
Down a bit. Sorry. Okay. Is that better? Yes. Okay. Not so echoey. So the relationship that he built up with her obviously ended up really traumatizing his relationship with his very loyal, very stoic, very Victorian wife. And we can see how this is the woman that he was faced with every day in his working life, beautifully painted here by Dante Gabriele Rossetti. This is a quote about her. "I was particularly struck with the most beautiful single figure in profile, with some smaller figures by a door in the background." You can see those here. "This, I thought, one of the finest things he has done." So, associating the intimate feeling he has for Maria Zambacco, he's able to portray her in this exquisite fashion. Here she is represented as love. There's an arrow here with Burne-Jones' name on it. There's a little cupid here, but she's holding a honeysuckle. Now, in the Victorian language of flowers, flowers meant something. When you gave a posy of flowers to somebody which you perhaps had designs on having a relationship with, they would interrogate, they would look and decipher all the individual flowers to be able to understand what the actual hidden message was. So this isn't honeysuckle just because it happens to be honeysuckle. Honeysuckle has a sexual connotation. And people would have known that, the literati would have known that as well. So it's admitting that not only has he placed her here as the figure of love, the personification of love, he has also added this honeysuckle, which is a note of allusion to a sexual relationship as well, which of course got him into a lot of trouble. Is it okay? Too close? Okay. So I move it down? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, it worked so well yesterday.
even put it on your shirt.
On my shirt, okay.
Yeah, because like when you're still talking.
Is that better? Okay. Is that better?
Yeah, it's going to be good.
Okay, it's going to be good. Great. Okay, so we've gone. Okay. But, of course, like many people during the Victorian era, they didn't give in to the passions of the heart, and very stoically, after Maria Zambacco threatened him with suicide, after he didn't agree to run away with her to Greece, she threatened him with a suicide attempt. And there was a terrible moment where he tried to save her out of the water, because she really did try to kill herself. And then he realized that it was all just getting too much. So in his head, he made the decision to stay with his family. And I came across this photograph of his family, which is rather an unfortunate photograph in that he swapped the rather lovely charms of the Greek exotic beauty for his rather dour-looking, long-suffering, obviously, Georgiana Burne-Jones. But this is the family. This is William Morris here. This is Burne-Jones. This is Jane Morris here, and their two children. This is Margaret and Philip, the children. And this is Burne-Jones's father at the back here, elderly father. So he made a very significant, important decision, but the relationship put him in a very nervous physical state and emotional state of anxiety. And her image stayed with him for a very long time. And rather significantly, the following year, he painted this painting, which is called Love Among the Ruins. And there's also a poem by Robert Browning, which starts, "Where the quiet-coloured end of evening smiles." And I think you can see the sort of pervading tone of this painting is that quiet colour of the end of evening. Last night there was a beautiful sunset across the sort of southern peninsula, a very soft rose-coloured infused light. And it's that type of effect that he's trying to achieve here. Harebells. Harebells are a sign of grief, but they are also a sign of submission. So he also have, they mean submission. So he's submitting to having ended the affair, but also perhaps to the grief that he feels about it and the love that he still feels for her, because this is very much her face in the beautiful figure here, and his ideal image next to her. The briar rose is also very interesting. We'll see it recurring quite often as a theme in many of his paintings. It's very thorny, as you can see here, but it also has this pale pink soft rose, which is a rose is a symbol of love. Pink moving to red would be an illusion of true love. But these thorns here, the briar rose is the symbol of pain and pleasure, which is, of course, really ultimately that was what his relationship was all about with her, was the idea of pain and pleasure. And it was at this time, 1871 and 1873, that he made two very significant trips to Italy. He loved Italy and everything about Italy, from the early Italian painters of Padua in the Scrovegni Chapel right up to the magnificence of the Sistine Chapel and everything in between. He absorbed it like a sponge, and in fact he used to call himself later in life Angelo, after Fra Angelico, because he felt that he had more affinity with the Italian artists than he did of the local ones. And it was here that we begin to see very significantly relationships with Italian artists and how he interprets and reimagines the paintings that he's seen in Italy and the sculptures, and he now brings them into his own work. And in this one, we can identify an allusion here, across the top here, this horizontal frieze above the door. There's classicizing elements here, of course, as well. But this is the Cantoria by Donatello. It was built for the Medici family for a wedding, so that the choir could stand in this Cantoria in the church. It's now in the Museum of Works underneath the cathedral in Florence. And you can see this sort of horizontal frieze of movement, very much echoed at the back here by this item that without question he would have come across during his travels in Florence. Florence was his favourite city, and the city that he perhaps could have ended up living in under different circumstances. He really felt very, very much at home. And it's interesting how his closest friend in the late 1860s, apart from his working associate, which was William Morris, his closest friend was, of course, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who he was half Italian, had an Italian father, but was absorbed into very strong Italian culture. But Rossetti never went to Italy. He only got as far as Paris on his honeymoon. He never went to Italy. So he had no visual connection to what Italian art was like, which is, in part, explains why Rossetti's work goes off into the tangent it does, and Burne-Jones follows the tangent that his does, because he is so connected now to what he has seen in Italy. So I actually just wanted to make a sort of disclaimer in a way. The work of Burne-Jones is vast, and if you incorporate all his drawings on paper, sketches for stained glass, all his public commissions as well as his paintings, his tapestries, his objects that he painted, it amounts to almost 1,000 pieces. I have, for this lecture series, decided to focus on the paintings rather than try to do a little bit of everything. We do talk about his other commissions as well, but I want you to become familiar with the paintings, which is why I've chosen to focus more than anything on the paintings. So, going back to his trips in Italy, he comes back from the first trip, and while he was there, he spent some time in San Gimignano, which he loved. He loved the towers and the medievalness of the city. Even if you go now, San Gimignano still has that air of a medieval city, sort of frozen in time, if you like. And he comes back and he produces this rather exquisite Danae and the Brazen Tower. Here she is, very classical figure, and she's looking on with aghast at what is happening at the back here. This is a stone tower, which is being clad in bronze. Danae was the daughter of King Acrisius, and he wanted to know if he was going to give birth to any sons. So he goes to the oracle at Delphi, and they say to him, no sons, and actually one day a son of your daughter is going to murder you. So of course, faced with the terrible dilemma, he has her locked up in a tower. Well, of course, the way of the gods in Greek mythology is that a story has a different ending. Zeus disguises himself as a golden shower, which rains down over the tower, and somehow the drops penetrate the tower, and she falls pregnant and gives birth to Perseus, a very, very significant figure who we'll be looking at in some depth tomorrow. And many, many years later, many trials and tribulations of poor Perseus later, it turns out that he attends Greek games, and throws a javelin, misses, and by mistake hits the head of the aging King Acrisius and kills him. So the oracle came true, even despite the great lengths that the father had gone to avoid his death by his own grandson. But this is right at the beginning of the story, very strong classical elements. Even the tree behind, you see these dotted around especially the Tuscan landscape. And I suppose these ventures that he went on, sometimes for 3, 4, 5 months at a time, really took his mind off the domestic problems and that he was very, very much involved in back at home. Because, of course, things were made public. The scandal of Maria Zambaco was very much a public story as well. A lot of these Victorian artists were dogged with romantic scandals, either related to their own wives or their own artist models. He declared, Rome impressed him the most in terms of the grandeur. He loved the art of Florence, he loved Botticelli, he loved Fra Angelico, but when he got to Rome, he was blown away by the volume, by the sheer size and magnitude of the works that he saw, especially the Sistine Chapel. Not just the chapel ceiling, but the paintings all around the edge, in particular the Perugino and the Botticellis. And he declared that Michelangelo was immeasurable. He loved the strength, the physical strength that Michelangelo put into his figures. But he also loved Luca Signorelli, and he loved Piero della Francesca. And I identify quite often, if you're familiar with the work of Piero della Francesca, especially the Legend of the Two Cross, the stillness of the figures, the sort of moment where you know they're focused so deeply on something, but you can't penetrate what that thing is that they're focused on, but there's just a stillness in time. You can see that already here. And he looked closely into these paintings. He followed their composition, he followed their styling, their colour, their soft, muted colours. He really was drawn immensely into the Italian art of the Quattrocento. I've included this because I think these groupings at the back here are relative to this work in Orvieto by Signorelli. This is the dead, the resurrected taking form, if you like, here. Particularly these groupings at the back here can be echoed with these forms here. But more than that, you may be very surprised to know that this is in the National Gallery in Cape Town. And if you go there, sadly it's not on display, public display at the moment, I did check, but I'm told on very good authority that if you ask, you can maybe, if the person is there, you would be taken into the basement and shown it. It's one of 4 Burne-Jones works that are actually in the South African National Gallery here in Cape Town. And this is worked on a vast scale. Coming back from these trips where he was familiar with Michelangelo, he started to paint big. Some of his paintings measure more than 2 meters tall. This one is about 2 meters high and about 2.5 meters wide. It really is vast. And his whole way of painting changed after his trips to Italy. And again, he very often uses these femme fatales. We'll come back to that now. And I suppose the personification, if you like, of Maria Zambacco into these figures, these are strong women who, through a sort of rather passive-aggressive means of luring their weaker men into their embrace, if you like, whether it's a physical embrace or an emotional embrace, he begins very often to focus on these very strong women, but they're not strong in an overt way. As I said, it's the passive-aggressive way where their beauty is an element that beguiles the weaker man in their own personal quest for beauty, which of course that is what Burne-Jones's art is all about. We looked at this right at the beginning yesterday because I spoke to you about a gallery known as the Grosvenor Gallery. This was very significant towards the end of the decade of the 1870s, where after 7 years of abstaining from exhibiting in public, Burne-Jones is invited to exhibit at the Grosvenor Gallery, 1877. And one of the paintings, he showed 8 paintings in that particular exhibition, and one of them is this one. And then the 4 main exhibits that really got the critics talking were these 4 here. This is Whistler, this is G.F. Watts, and this is Albert Moore here. And we're going to look at those in more detail now. But the opening of the Grosvenor Gallery caused an immense stir amongst the art world in London. Very similar, in fact, to the opening of the Manchester Art Treasures exhibition. But what was so special then about the Grosvenor Gallery? Why was suddenly everybody talking about the Grosvenor Gallery and not what was traditionally the main gallery for artists at the time, which was the Royal Academy? What was this so special about this rival gallery space? Well, as we had with Thomas Fairbairn, it always takes somebody with a vision, and in this case money, to be able to start a project like this. And here we have the rather attractive couple, Sir Coutts Lindsay and his lovely wife, Lady Caroline Blanche. And I've put in brackets here, she was a Rothschild, and there was money. So they could afford to set up this gallery. They were both artists themselves, but not successful in the sense that they were Royal Academicians. Their work was very often rejected from the panels at the Royal Academy. But they had commissions. In fact, Sir Coutts Lindsay painted many paintings inside the Dorchester Hotel, which sadly have been painted over the years. They worked as artists, but they weren't successful. But they felt that part of their failure was not perhaps their artistic inability, but it was the fact that there was nowhere to showcase art other than the Royal Academy. And there was very few spaces that you could go and see. People could go and see the work of contemporary artists and have a look perhaps at a body of their work to get a sense of what they were capable of doing, so that you could then put forward a commission for them. There was nothing like this. So together they pooled their resources and they opened to great acclaim in 1877 the Grosvenor Gallery. It was situated in New Bond Street, which is an incredibly fashionable area at the time, right in the heart of the very wealthy district of Mayfair, although Mayfair at the time had another side of life to it. I can't think what the market is called now. It's just off Curzon Street. Shepherd's Market, yeah, that's it. Shepherd's Market was where Rossetti used to go looking for models, but by night, by day, genteel ladies would take a stroll through Shepherd's Market, but by night it was an entirely different environment. It's not quite the place it is today. The place to exhibit art was the Royal Academy. People trained at the Royal Academy. They tried to stay as a Royal Academician. You were invited to become an associate before you were allowed to be a full member. And of course, the great summer exhibitions, which started 250 years ago, 2018 was the anniversary of that. It was, if you could get your picture into the summer exhibition, you were halfway to having a successful artistic career. But the Royal Academy came with a lot of problems for artists. One of them is that it was all about selling pictures, as many as possible. So that meant cramming them in. And as you can see in the background here, it's literally one across the other. There's no room for any details about the pictures. Everything was put in as much as possible. And the discussion in these groups was about selling. It was all about promoting and selling. Not promoting the artist, but promoting the academy as a sales room. And on these days, this is a private view. Well, that's rather a joke in a way, because it's absolutely packed full of people. And that was one of the problems. Because the private viewings at the Royal Academy became a social event as well, more people went who were really interested in looking at the pictures. So it was great if you got your picture in. They gave preference on the lower stands to Royal Academicians. So if you were trying to break into the art market and you got your picture hung up here, what they call above the line, and if it was a small picture like this, you really had very little chance of anybody actually seeing it and recognizing it. What happens is that these events become, as I said, the social event. So look who you've got here: the Countess of Lonsdale, Lord Leighton, Robert Browning, Gladstone, Anthony Trollope, Lily Langtry, who of course famously was the mistress of Edward VII before he was Edward VII. And you've got Oscar Wilde here, you've got Helen Terry, and this is John Millais here. So they become a place to be seen rather than somewhere to go to actually view the art. And this is something that the Coutts Lindsays wanted to change in their development of the Grosvenor Gallery. This is a lovely painting here, Public Opinion. So it's people crowded around a specific painting. They've got their sale sheets in hand, desperately trying to look at things. But at the same time, it's very much this sort of social event. This is a lovely comment from The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. And it says the Academy is too large, too vulgar. You must certainly send it next year to the Grosvenor. So the Grosvenor was already emerging as something different. And he says, I've gone there. There have been either so many people that I've not been able to see the pictures, which was dreadful, or so many pictures that I've not been able to see the people, which was even worse. So openings of galleries are still actually very much like that. If you want to see the art, don't go to the opening day. Go the day after, when all the socialites have gone, the champagne's been put away, and you can actually engage with the art itself. And this is varnishing day. The thing about the type of work that was on display at the Royal Academy very much adhered to a traditional manner. The paintings very often adhered to a specific colour palette. This is what the Pre-Raphaelites were rebelling against. And on the day before the exhibition, as you can see from this cartoon here, people went in and covered their entire picture with a brown varnish, just in case there was too much brightness in the colour. So everything had a same look about it as well. And this, of course, changes during the 1880s. But up until this point, you knew the type of work that you were going to get at the Royal Academy. And people went specifically for that. This is a thing that the Lindsay's wanted to counter with the opening of the Grosvenor Gallery. They wanted to accommodate these new progressive artists with their different ideas, with their symbolism, with their moving aside of narrative works and focusing more on a stronger colour palette. You can see this was the wall colour of the 2018 summer exhibition. And this was the wall, this is 1797, the year it opened. So in a way, the room space has changed because it used to be at Somerset House. It's now on Piccadilly. And the colours changed, everything's brightness, but essentially the concept of the summer exhibition has remained the same. And it's very much an emphasis on selling, and it's very, very crowded, even if, as I did, go last summer and have a look at it. So when the Grosvenor opened, it opened to such huge acclaim because it was so different. One thing is that it was never going to be on a par with the Manchester Art Treasures exhibition in terms of its philanthropic art for all concept. It was not art for all. It was art for a very elite. This was art for connoisseurs, people who were interested, not necessarily just interested in old masters, but very much interested in the progressive art world of the time. They tried to create a concept where you felt as comfortable as you would staying for a weekend in an aristocratic country home. The walls were painted. The walls were covered in silk damasks. There were beautiful Georgian marbles. There were comfortable seats in all the gallery rooms so that you could sit and you could look. And they had a very specific way of hanging. They clumped together the works of one artist at a time. So you could get a sense of Millet's work, for example, or Burne Jones' work, seeing as we're talking about him. 8 pictures all together, so that you could see where he can do this, he can do that, and in your head you can begin to have a conversation around the work of Burne Jones. And very often the artists were encouraged to spend time in the gallery as well, so that potential patrons could have a conversation with you, get to know you, and then create a much more personalised relationship. They tried to create a space where conversations around art were very comfortable. To receive an at-home invitation from Lady Blanche Lindsay was one of the highlights of the summer season, and she really was the strength behind the concept, if you like. Sir Coutts Lindsay, he established everything. He undertook the building and the interior decoration, but she managed it socially. And when she leaves a few years later, there are some devastating consequences because of it. It has this very grand opening here. The door apparently was taken from a Palladian church from Venice, Santa Lucia. And so the whole thing had this sense of intimidation, if you like, this sense of awe, this sense of entering into what was going to be a very, very special place. You can see here, they changed. The first year that they exhibited, the walls were red, and then the second year after that they were green. So they changed, as galleries do today, the wall colour behind. If you hang certain pictures against different coloured backgrounds, they talk to you in a different way. when I do a PowerPoint presentation of Renaissance art, I like to use a black background because the strong colours of Renaissance painting, the blues and the reds and the gilt, has a better impact on a black background. Victorian art always looks good on stronger colours like red or dark blue or green, and they were mindful of that. So they were intent on creating an aesthetic atmosphere. They were very concerned in the beauty of not only the individual artworks, but the space with which these paintings were being displayed at the time. And you can get a sense of that here. These are just an idea. They had very innovative features to the gallery. They had a billiard room, they had a ladies' room, they had a smoking room, they had a rotating library, so you could go and spend time in the gallery and sit and be involved in the space, even without having anything to do with the art. And very much in a way like the idea of the Manchester Art Treasures exhibition, both of these exhibitions lay down the foundations of what gallery viewing is for all of us today. You can go to, sadly not here in Cape Town, but many of the galleries around the world, and just go and have a cup of coffee, and you might have a glance at an artwork on the way. It's not so much about going in and buying as it was certainly with the Royal Academy. Everything about the place led you in to these two wings here, the East Gallery and the West Gallery. This is the West Gallery, where the pictures of Burne-Jones were hung on that very first night. And the gallery space is in itself leading you in, drawing you in to finally, the biggest room is at the end. Very often you're faced with the most important things first, whereas this was all about building up the anticipation, creating an atmosphere for you. And this was one of the paintings, which is an extraordinary piece of work, which was exhibited on that opening night. It's called The Days of the Creation, and as you can see, there are 6 panels. This is exactly how Burne-Jones created it. He made the frame, he wrote the inscription here along the top, which comes from the Book of Daniel, and he wanted the whole thing must stay together and be exhibited together, even to the point of including on the back of each frame, he wrote these little cards, and they're still there. And it says, this picture is not complete by itself, but it is number 2 of a series of 6 watercolour pictures representing the days of creation, which are placed in a frame designed by the painter, from which he desires they may not be removed. And he had this vision, this complete work was his vision, rather than just individual panels. This is what you were supposed to look at. And you can see the variations of colour. When at the beginning of the quote, when it says that they were overwhelmed by the winged angels of Burne-Jones, it's to this painting that they are referring. The wings here, you can see there's a colour palette of sort of rust browns, purples, blues, quite subdued greys, and each one is individual. They're individual, yet at the same time they have a sameness about them. And that sameness, of course, also refers very much to the same features that belong to Maria Zambacco. You start here with the day of creation, very subdued here, because on the first day, the only thing that happened was that light was separated from darkness. And then as the days move forward, you can see here the waters and the land are separated here. And each originating angel, if you like, or the originator angel, the one who does the creation, has a flame above its head, and then that person is included. So this is the originator of this one, but she who started the creation is holding the sphere at the back. And as you go on, at the bottom one, there are 6 figures crammed into this space. He loved to do that. Without a doubt, he would have seen the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, the wall painting by Michelangelo, where there seems to be an excess of people crammed into this small space. He liked that idea of creating full scenes where you really had to look. So I just want to show you, I want to show you that just a little bit more in detail. These are feathers, but they're not real feathers. They're feathers made of fabric in a way. They're soft, but at the same time they've got strength behind them because they curve around here. He had an amazing vision, a textile and tactile vision for fabrics, and we know he was very involved in creating tapestries. He understood the fall of fabric, the drape of it, and of course very often that was inspired not only by the Elgin marbles at the British Museum, but again by his time spent in Italy. And you can see this very much this sameness here. Behind a lot of Burne-Jones' anxiety was an anxiety for the disappearance of the world that he felt comfortable in. He noticed with some horror how London was transforming. He lived in a place called the Grange, which when he moved there was described as a small village on the edge of London known as Fulham. By the time he leaves there, there is a train line arriving to Fulham. And of course, with the train line would come the building prospectors. And of course, history can tell us what happened next. He was concerned that his world was transforming at a rate that he was not able to keep up with. The Industrial Revolution challenged him, and he didn't want to embrace the technology that came with the Industrial Revolution because he was concerned about the consequences of that technology and the capitalist society, the poverty, the grime. He was brought up in Birmingham, remember, central Birmingham. So he famously makes this lovely quote, which for me almost sort of sums up his mentality, especially at this moment. The more materialistic science becomes, the more angels I shall paint. Their wings are my protest in favour of the immortality of the soul. He has this desire to really forge himself on a personal quest for beauty and using his strong, fervent imagination to consolidate that. And what we're going to be looking at tomorrow will be the culmination, if you like, of the end of his artistic life, where he produces these great cycles of quest stories, and they really do mirror his own personal quest to stay within the imagination of the life that he's forged for himself. But let's look quickly at the detail here. You could see that he was going to become good at tapestry design because a lot of his paintings reflect that idea that he has. This dense quality around here, the flowers, the shrubbery, the foliage, everything around the edge here is where there's a gap, he fills it with something. But what I think is interesting is these faces. They are slightly different. If you look at them, they're not all the same face, but they sort of are also all the same face. And again, they are that androgynous look. They are neither male nor female, along with angels. Are angels male or are angels female? They acquire both traits, both traditional traits, if you like, of facial and physical expression. But what I thought is interesting here, this is the last, this is the globe of the day before, when animals and birds have been created, and this is the one from day 6, which is the creation of Adam and Eve. And look at the detail here. The tree behind here. But to me, what is most sinister, and it's this, keep this image in your head for tomorrow. This snake, look at it. It's, to me, it would be the stuff of nightmares to be trapped in a sphere with a huge snake. Sometimes in the work of Burne-Jones, when you look at the work, you think, oh my goodness, that is so beautiful, because you're overwhelmed by the softness of the colour, you're overwhelmed by the sweetness of the facial expressions. There doesn't appear to be any aggression or any nastiness in it until you look inside it and you see this and you begin to shiver and you think, oh, that's such a horrible thought, this snake trapped inside of these, and your imagination, as his was so fervent, could run away with you at this stage. When you look at the section of the painting here, you've got this lovely angel with a musical instrument, the roses. There's nothing sinister about this at all. But then when you look in, sometimes there is a darker side to him, and that's very much a mirror of his own personality. And he battled with these bouts of anxiety where he went into a very, very dark space, and it comes out the manifestation of these dark spaces that he finds himself in are very often these small elements of sinister, unnerving inclusions like this. And we'll see this snake serpent again when we look at some work tomorrow. So just to give you a sense of who was who and what was he competing with at the Grosvenor Gallery. This is G.F. Watts, Albert Moore, and Whistler. And they were very much part of the aesthetic movement. They believed strongly in the concept of art for art's sake. They rejected narrative. They were focused far more on colour, a reduction of colour palette, for example. This painting here by Albert Moore is just simply a lovely lady in a classical contrapposto form composition, and the only two colours here are blue and orange. Blue and orange sit opposite each other on the colour wheel. They're complementary colours of each other. So the shadow is created just with blue and orange. The depth is created just with blue and orange. And it's almost as if the blue turban here enhances the tiny fraction of orange that she's holding in her hands. That's all this painting is about. It's called Sapphire. It's not even entitled. There's not even an acknowledgement in the title to there is the presence of a human form. They don't want you to notice that. They want you to look at the beauty of it, the harmony of it, blue and orange, and the colour will take you into, the title rather, takes you completely away from any human content that you might feel is connected to it. This one here is called Love and Death. This really elevated G.F. Watts. Again, there's two paintings in the National Gallery by G.F. Watts in Cape Town. And it was very much a personal vision of his. A very close friend of his was dying at the time that he produced this painting. And he observed very carefully how this person was kept alive through the love and tenderness of the family members who looked after him. But ultimately, the winner was death, because despite the showering of love onto this poor person, in the end, death was the stronger. And he produced this beautiful painting from that thought that he had in his head when he was watching his friend pass away. So you have love here, surrounded by roses, the winged Cupid. The roses are being trampled on. The small figure of Cupid is about to be overwhelmed by this vast and ghostly and, again, slightly menacing figure of death, shrouded in this classical drapery. Death conquers love in the end, was the message from this. So it's more about an emotional response than an actual figurative story. And then, of course, the drama of the time comes with Whistler. Whistler had come across from America and was making a name for himself in a very, very notorious fashion, because he gave away completely to colour and harmony and no narrative whatsoever. And he referred to all his paintings with musical titles. So this one is called Nocturnes in Blue and Gold. And it caused a lot of problems at the time. People were astonished at these paintings because of their lack of narrative, their lack of personal and human interest, aside from the G.F. Watts, which of course does have that human narrative element to it. But the dominating element here is this concept of death. This one caused a huge libel case. Ruskin very famously says, I have seen, and I remember Ruskin is old school, quite a traditional art critic, although he followed and patronized. He first of all was the patron of Turner, who in himself was a very innovative painter. He felt that this one, he said, I have seen and heard much of Cockney impudence before now, but never expected to hear a coxcomb, which of course is an insult, ask 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face. And this instigated a huge libel case that, although Whistler won it, he was only awarded a farthing in rewards, and he won a moral victory, but sadly it rendered him bankrupt, and he left the country and was not able to. He left the country for a while, went to Europe, but he was not really able to recover from that. Ruskin lost financially or lost the moral victory, but of course had a different outcome for him. But Ruskin was incensed that painting had been reduced to this state. Now, we're looking 1877. The first Impressionist exhibition in France was 1874. So that explosion of change into the art world was only really very much talked about as something that happened in France. This type of painting was not happening in England at the time, but of course it does begin to seep in later on. So you can imagine how this type of work would have, the type of response that it would have received. Anyway, let's move on back to Burne-Jones. He goes back to a theme that he's already treated, which we looked at yesterday. We'll see a lot in his work. He's got favourite stories, favourite people, favourite elements from mythology and from historical tales that he goes back to again and again. But as his body of work moves forward, they become reduced in their narrative content. Here we had Nimue and Merlin at the back here. Remember, there's the little dog. She's got the book of spells. She's going to lure him into his sort of dark, gloomy grave. Different model here. This was Fanny Cornforth. She was the very voluptuous prostitute favourite of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, the larger-than-life woman, and blonde hair, as we see here. This is, of course, the Beguiling of Merlin, presented in he painted it during this time, but he presented it in 1877 at the opening. And here, of course, is, without question, the lovely figure of Maria Zambacco. But she's now in a very scary figure. She is the snake-haired temptress, Nimue, who beguiles Merlin and seduces him, steals his book of spells, and without the book of spells, Merlin is nothing. And perhaps Burne-Jones sees himself in this position, because without the power of Maria Zambacco over him, he also feels a reduction in his masculinity and his artistic ability as well. And that's documented in many letters to his friends. So Merlin is now reduced to this sort of limp, if you look at the composition here, he's in a much more subordinate role to her. Despite her slender form, she's strong. She's holding the strength of the book. She's holding it up with two hands. You can get the sense that there's power in this book, and the weight of that power she's holding up. He's lost it and has now slumped into this tree as well. I thought it was quite interesting, just looking at the whole composition here, what parts of Italian art he might have been keen on. A lot of paintings around the 1460s, 1470s and 80s in Italy, especially in Florence, had this sort of gloomy bit at the bottom with water, but almost as if this forms like a stage setting. We see it a lot in the work of Mantegna. I don't know if any of you saw the Mantegna and Bellini exhibition, which was at the National Gallery last year. They put the works together. You see how they use the land, but they raise it up as a platform, so the figures are set on a stage. And they do that here. This is the Baptism of Christ by Verrocchio and Leonardo. And I thought those elements of compositional elements from Renaissance art, Burne-Jones was definitely looking at and reimagining in his own play. So we begin to see a regular emergence of these femme fatales, these strong women with their passive-aggressive stances. There's nothing at first glance that looks anything aggressive about this slender, rather lovely, drapery-clad figure from antiquity. Yet, when we know what she's done and what she's capable of doing, again, a chill comes to the bones, and you want to be very mindful of her, very wary of her. I mentioned to you that from the work from his time in Rome, he started to work in dramatic, large volume, large form. This is called the Wheel of Fortune, and just look at the sheer size of it. This is huge. This is at the current Tate exhibition, and they're bigger than life-size figures inside it. This dominant figure of Fortune here as she turns the wheel. But what's interesting for me is that this placing here and the identification of these three people. Very simply, are you able to identify them? The poet here at the bottom has the olive wreath around his head, the sign of intellectual capability. This is the poet. The poet is being trampled on or stepped on the shoulder here by the king. The king just simply has a crown. They're all naked, so they're all equal. In the wheel of fortune, when the wheel of fortune spins, it doesn't matter if you are a slave or a king or a poet, everybody's treated the same. And the nudity gives us that continuity of thought. This is the slave at the top here. It's not very easy to see, but there's just a chain around his ankle and around the top of the leg here. The slave onto the king, onto the poet. This is the way of life. This is the way of being. And everything is turned by this monumental figure of fortune at the side here. But fortune, sometimes one would associate with good things, but of course fortune is double-sided. It's good fortune and it's bad fortune. And so she becomes rather more an ambiguous figure. The dark tonal greys give her again slightly, not so much as sinister, but slightly disquiet or unquiet sense. We feel drawn into her power because of her volume and the grandiose size of her. But at the same time, there's a steeliness, and the colour palette is so reduced in this painting to the sort of flesh tones, the browns, the greys, the blacks, the shadows. She doesn't look at us. Fortune never looks at you. When you see tarot cards, for example, or fortune is blind, because fortune can swing. The wheel can turn in either direction. Again, very allegorical. And I wanted to just illustrate for you how his vision and his time in Rome, the things that he would have looked at. These are the prisoners on your way into the academy to see the David. Make sure you always pause on either side to look at the prisoners, which were the unfinished works of Michelangelo in his studio on his death. Figures that were, as he claimed during his life, were trapped in the stone, and all he had to do was merely set them free. But which indicates that he had a vision of the thing before it appeared. And we really get that sense of that here. You feel that the rest of this body is just waiting to be chipped away, which in a sense it is, but in the same sense it's going to take the talent of that one person to set it free. And of course the nudity of the Sistine Chapel ceiling as well certainly have a bearing on this form here. He reimagined this, Phyllis and Demophoon. He reimagined them as the tree of forgiveness. These were lovers, these two here, Phyllis and Demophoon. Demophoon says that he has to go away for a time, but he will come back, and of course he never comes back. And she's left pining, and she ends up being turned into an almond tree. And then Demophoon breaks his promise, and he does come back. At which point she bursts out of the tree, takes life form, and tries to beguile him and tries to trap him, if you like. And she does that with her arms here and her cloth. You can see emerging from the tree. And she does that again here. But it's interesting for me how this time he's covered up the male, which was so damaging, the nudity of the male at the Old Watercolour Society. But at the Grosvenor, they're quite happy with the female form and almost the full male form. But he has been a little more modest with the male form here. So it's interesting how over time he has reimagined this same theme that caused him so much extravagance, it caused him so much trouble with the Old Watercolour Society. And for me, there is no doubt that he would have observed this. This was dug up in 1506 and proved to be a huge inspiration for late Renaissance artists. The tension of this body, there's so little left in the fragment. It's now in the Vatican Garden, but it was very significant for the forming of the physical body, especially the abdomen here. And to me, he without a doubt would have observed the strength and the tension of the muscle in that case. We very often think of Burne-Jones as sort of dreamy, ethereal, living his figures carry a sort of otherworldly sense about them. Their feet are not necessarily on solid ground. They're coming out of a tree or they're perched on a pedestal of some sort. They're not quite belonging to the real world, certainly not in the way that the figures of Rossetti were very much earthly real women. His women carry this sort of sense of otherworldliness. And this is what he writes himself about a picture. I mean by a picture, a beautiful, romantic dream of something that never was, never will be, in a light better than any light that ever shone, in a land that no one can define or remember, only desire. So his paintings in this later part of his life become all about the emotional state of looking at them. They appeal to the senses, the soft